Panacea Charitable Trust came into existence in 2012 after a pre-existing religious organisation called the Panacea Society ceased to function. All the members had essentially died out. And the trust is not a continuation of the religious life of that organisation at all, but it is in a sense an attempt to make sense of the legacy of that organisation in the contemporary world and to use its resources and artefacts and such like to explain the kind of things that the Panacea Society and similar movements were up to. I became a trustee because I've always had a passion for the study and understanding of minority religious movements, which I feel have been a vital part of human society, but they're often rather mocked and ridiculed by rather larger religious and secular kind of organisations. So that's my personal motivation. I mean, I'm also an academic who studies religion professionally, but I actually became a trustee because I think I'm one of the few people who'd ever heard of the Panacea Society. By the time I became involved, it was a tiny a movement. I mean, it had previously been really quite famous in the 30s and 40s and such like. I mean, even Monty Python has a sketch about them. At one stage they were well known, but by the time I became involved, there were really only a handful of people. And when they heard that somebody knew about them and they were in need of people who were sympathetic in the sense, not believing the things they believed, but people who weren't hostile or going to mock them, and they needed trustees, that's when I became involved. Well, the other trustees are quite a diverse bunch of historically men and women. What motivates them? Well, they come from a number of different backgrounds. So they come from everything from being a lawyer to an academic to being a probation officer, this sort of thing. They're motivated, I suppose, by a concern for the public good. I mean, what we have here is an organisation which may not be well known, but its legacy was a significant one, and these people are motivated really to ensure that in some way that legacy is understood and communicated in the contemporary world. I think the concept of a centre studying these things is so pertinent and absolutely timely because of, on the one level, global events that actually, although sometimes politicians and also academics have a hard time understanding this, some of the motivating factors behind some of the very significant global events today could be said to be apocalyptic. So if you think about some of the more negative events in the world history, if you look at a movement like ISIS, for example, it's essentially an apocalyptic movement. So the members are driven by a particular understanding of the future of the world and their part in bringing that about. But it's also pertinent because of perhaps some larger issues. For example, when we look at questions like climate change, etc., there's a significant chunk of the population of the world who are not members of these small religious movements, but actually have a worldview which is affected by this fundamental way of understanding the way the world works, this apocalyptic kind of thinking. So it is incredibly significant today to understand these groups. The centre will be located in Bedford. Why is it in Bedford? Well, it's in Bedford because that's where the Panacea Society were based, and Bedford to them was not just a sort of accident. For them, Bedford was where they were based because Bedford was the site of the original Garden of Eden, and we have tried very hard to maintain what we call the campus, the buildings around this site, which were incredibly important to them. We have an absolutely wonderful museum which interprets the Panacea Society and allows you to see their artefacts and also those of related movements. But it's also in Bedford, I think, for another reason. I mean, as a charitable trust, we could have just taken the resources and said, let's go and take those somewhere else, say Oxford, Cambridge, London, and engage in this activity there. But I think it's incredibly important that this takes place in Bedford. for all kinds of reasons, but one of them I think is because this is part of Bedford's history and legacy, and Bedford has a rich religious history. There's a Bunyan Museum just around the corner, for example, and so it should be here. It shouldn't be taken somewhere else. But also, when we do these events that we're planning in the future, it's absolutely wonderful for them to take place in somewhere that's so steeped in this kind of thinking. Absolutely a brilliant location, so I'm incredibly pleased that we'll be able to base it here. But I would say it's physically based here, but this is a centre which has international sort of expectations, so we really hope that the way we're going to present what we do will be accessible to people wherever they are in the world, whether you can physically get here or not. The internet is vital to this project. It's crucial that there's a sense in which the public as well as scholars can engage with what's going on here. And whilst Bedford is absolutely wonderful, and I'm lucky to live not too far away and to be able to get here myself quite easily, I'm very conscious that there's people, for example, in Australia or wherever, who are interested in what's going on here, and they're not going to be able to do it, but we will be making our resources accessible to anybody. The centre is funded by the Panacea Charitable Trust. Now, that is a charitable trust, so it falls under UK charity law, and you can have a look for yourself. It's all incredibly transparent, so it's essentially investments following the regulations of UK charity law, and we own a number of buildings in Bedford too that provides resources for us. I want to emphasise that is where all of the funding comes from, and they essentially are the assets and legacy of a now defunct religious organisation, that we have no agenda based on who's giving us money. And that's vital for us. And particularly in studying religion, that is very unusual in the contemporary world. Even when you look at centres based in universities, if you push hard enough, you will find that there's often funding provided for those centres by people who have particular agendas in relation to the religion being studied, and we do not. So this is absolutely brilliant opportunity to seriously scrutinise and think about this without having any strings attached. There are a number of contemporary problems that I think most people say are pretty pressing, ranging from climate change to radicalisation, terrorism, etc. And I think what often isn't really recognised is the role that apocalyptic thinking has in these particularly pressing issues, either as a causal factor. So, for example, a significant amount of terrorism, both religious but also interestingly secular, is driven by a fundamentally apocalyptic idea that the world needs to be changed through some kind of crisis that they're going to induce in order to achieve some kind of utopia at the end of it. But also apocalypticism affects perhaps the way people even think about some of the things they're encountering. So, for example, the climate change, you often get people talking in terms of catastrophe. It seems in Western culture, if you're ever going to describe anything significant happening in the world, you end up using images that are frankly taken from the Book of Revelation, even if people don't realise it. The language there has become so embedded in the way that people understand the world. Now, you don't need to read or know the Bible to be very familiar with that kind of language, because it's used in documentaries, in horror films, in science fiction and all that sort of thing. So it really is something which shapes the way we look at the world. So today, as we encounter these problems, apocalypticism is clearly something that's not peripheral, but it's central. It's important that an understanding of apocalyptic and millenarianism is present in contemporary thinking today, or at least is understood in contemporary thinking today, for a range of reasons. I think one of them that's particularly pressing, and why we started this centre, why it's particularly timely that we started this centre now, is that there is such a dearth of understanding of this. There's such a lack of understanding. The people, from policymakers, for example, to indeed academics, often completely misunderstand the role that this plays. They either dismiss it, they consider it to be in the past, or they have these kind of caricatured ideas about it. We need serious, nuanced, intelligent and informed thinking about these factors if we are to understand many contemporary events today. The centre should benefit everybody. Now, that might sound incredibly ambitious, but I really can't stress this enough, that although the way we're designing the centre is that a group of scholars will come together regularly to think and thrash out the ideas around apocalypticism and millenarianism, and think hard about those and generate papers and such like. It's not ending there. This is not just one of those academic centres that just publishes papers for other academics to read. Complete waste of time. That's not what we're doing. What's absolutely vital for us is that these ideas and ways of thinking about apocalypticism and millenarianism are themselves capable of being understood by anybody who's interested. Indeed, I hope the centre will develop in such a way that people will realise that even if they're not interested now, in the future more people will see that this is actually a vital subject and they really need to understand it. The centre should, over the years, and as I said, this is a centre which is independently funded and is sufficiently endowed that it should be around for decades and centuries to come. Over the years, it will create a fascinating body of knowledge and understanding of apocalyptic and millenarianism, which will itself be a sort of legacy. So it would be really interesting, say 100 years from now, to look back at what the centre's done, because it would tell you about the kinds of things that people have been interested in over that period. And although every society somehow thinks that it is the kind of pinnacle of human achievement and the kind of questions it's interested in are really the only ones that matter, it's quite clear that actually a lot of things look a bit odd in the rearview mirror. And so some of the things that are very pressing for us now will be very different, say 10, 15, 20 years from now. And I think this is a reasonable bet, apocalyptic thinking, millenarian thinking will be vital in the decades to come. And it'll always be a subject worth studying.